Hello and welcome back. So today we're talking about whether corporations uh, can even make ethical decisions. Can they be ethically responsible, right? Can you say that a corporation is morally responsible for something they did? Are they even the types of things that are moral creatures? And this is by Peter French. There's a picture of Professor French right there. So, we attribute moral blame to human persons all the time, and that's what we've been talking about so far, in terms of ethical theories, when is an action like, what makes an action like killing wrong? What makes an action like helping another person morally right? Uh, so we haven't worried too much about this issue so far. We've been mostly thinking about, individual people. But in business ethics, part of that is, attributing can is a business even the sort of thing to which ethics applies, right? Or is it only individual human beings? So, if I went to the beach and clubbed a seal or poured oil on a seal, then it'd be relatively straightforward that I did a bad thing, an immoral thing, and I ought to be punished, right? Um, but what if an oil tanker owned by Shell Oil runs aground on a rock, spills oil on the beach, and that covers the seal, right? So a bad thing happened, but who's to blame, right? Is there anyone to blame, is the question. Should we blame the ship's captain? Maybe if the captain was being irresponsible, um, or we might blame the captain's boss if the boss, you know, ordered the captain to do something that caused the spill. Would it be the boss's boss if, in general, that boss was whatever cutting costs in a way that caused the oil spill? Um, or can we blame Shell Oil, the corporation itself, right, rather than some individual employee of Shell Oil? Does that even make sense, right? Or is trying to blame a corporation for something like trying to blame a rock or a building for something, right? A rock, whatever, falls off a mountain and lands on my head. Do I try to take the rock to court? That doesn't seem to make sense. Or corporations also just not the sorts of things that you can blame. French ultimately, just to frame things, will argue that yes, you can, that corporations can be um, morally responsible for things, and then later we'll see some writers who argue that they can't. So a key notion here, um, when we ask whether corporations can be morally responsible for their actions, or even whether corporations are the sorts of things that even do actions, um, is the notion of personhood. So, um, probably typically in everyday life, when you use the word person, you mean a human being, and lots of human beings are persons, right? Lots of persons are human beings, but they're not the same concept. So, personhood in this context is going to be uh, a moral entity, right? A moral person is the sort of thing that can be praised or blamed for doing something. Uh, Babies are not persons yet in this sense, right? So if a baby uh, spills your coffee or accidentally hurts you, you know, we don't blame them. We don't put babies on trial. We don't put babies in jail. We don't say you did something wrong. They're not sufficiently developed yet to be persons in that sense, even though they are human beings. And likewise, there might be aliens that aren't human beings, but they might qualify as persons. So Data from Star Trek, who's, an android, he seems sufficiently intelligent, sufficiently uh, capable of understanding ethics and right and wrong that, if Data killed someone, you would blame Data and say Data did something wrong, right? Likewise, an angel might be morally praised or blamed. If there was a dolphin or a whale that was sufficiently intelligent, we might praise or blame that animal as well. So persons and human beings, separate categories, lots of overlap there. Um, but what we're interested in is personhood. Right? It seems like at a minimum, right? What makes babies not persons is their lack of intelligence. So it seems to be a person, same with rocks, right? To be a person, it seems like at least a necessary condition would be to have the sufficient intelligence to be able to understand right and wrong, right, and to therefore be accountable when you choose to do something wrong. So French actually makes a sort of a finer distinction. He says, look, there could be metaphysical personhood and moral personhood. So it might be the case that intelligence is a necessary condition um, for moral responsibility, but you might need something else, right? Or it could be the case that if you are intelligent enough to qualify as a metaphysical person, you automatically qualify as a moral person. We'll see other senses of personhood as well crop up. Um, and so I don't know that he doesn't necessarily solve this problem, but he does want to put these distinctions on the board. Right? So, for example, Rawls has a definition of metaphysical persons. He calls them rational, self-interested beings, right? So if a robot is rational and self-interested, then it's a person, a metaphysical person. If an alien were rational and self-interested, it would be a person. Uh, Babies aren't rational enough to be persons yet. And for Rawls, even an adult human, if they are, cognitively deficient to the level that they can't rationally pursue their own self-interest, then they wouldn't be metaphysical persons as well. So he starts with metaphysical persons, and then he derives the moral part by, you'll recall, putting people in the original position, having them hash out the rules of a society. Um, those might also be the moral rules, or at least Hobbes would say so. Um, there might be, again, the rules of society and the moral rules don't have to be the same. And when we saw there are, there can be some problems with that. But, probably a bunch of people in the original position will all decide, hey, let's create a prohibition on murder, right? That seems to be in everybody's interest, and so that'll become a moral rule. So Rawls doesn't really, he says some things about persons, right? He defines a metaphysical person, and then he moves to the moral, but he doesn't tell us what he thinks about, nations and businesses and churches, whether those could be metaphysical persons and thus then possibly moral persons. Uh, in some passages, he seems to allow that it's possible, but then other passages, he seems to say, well, a business is really just a group of people, right? And it's the human persons that are the locus of moral responsibility. Um, so if that's the case, then a business or a corporation wouldn't be morally responsible. So Rawls is a little ambiguous. There's a third notion of personhood besides the metaphysical and the moral, which is legal personhood. So um, different countries, different states, different legal codes do have criteria by which someone or something qualifies as a person that then there can therefore be punished under the law um, or has certain rights under the law. And so some legal systems do treat corporations as persons. In the United States, we do. Um, other legal systems might not. It's sort of a practical question, not a deep metaphysical or philosophical question. But it is something that has to be answered on a practical level. So, for example, the ancient Romans saw corporations as fictions, right? So they were creations of the state. Fiction, sort of like uh, Peter Pan is a story, right, that was written out, and so we can talk about Peter Pan, but he's not real. So also the state can create a corporation, and it's a fictional entity, but it can still have rights and obligations within the state. So um, on this view, right, a corporation is not just a composite of human beings, and so any moral responsibility would fall on the humans. Instead, it's an entity in its own right, and so if it had personhood, it would be the corporations, not the the persons that compose it. The competing view, which is kind of implicit, is the aggregate theory, right? So instead of saying, look, a corporation is an entity on its own, other people say, no, corporation isn't really a thing on its own. It's just a group of people, right? That's the aggregate theory. It's just composed of human persons. So the corporation itself doesn't really have any personhood of its own. If we do want to attribute any kind of personhood, it really is just dependent on the personhood of the people that form the corporation, right? So um, French doesn't favor this view, right? Because he think it ignores something important about corporations, which is that they have a structure, right? So they're not just an aggregate, right? It's not just like a pile of sand that's composed of individual grains of sand. Um, there's different people in the corporation have different amounts of power. there's the CEO, right? The chief executive officer, there's a chief financial officer, there's a mail clerk down at the bottom, and there's a structure. So there's a difference between a corporation and a mob, he thinks. It's not just an aggregate. So the legal personhood view, so the aggregate theory um, seems to be popular. We'll see some philosophers that seem to hold it, um, but in a legal sense, it rarely uh, prevails. So, for example, to take one example, during World War II, when Britain was at war with Germany, um, there was a British company that was owned by a bunch of Germans, right? So you might think, okay, um, all these people are now enemies, right? So should we take this corporation, confiscate its assets? And in fact, uh, that view lost, right? They said, no, this company has the rights of a British citizen, even though it's composed of German citizens, right? I'm sorry, this is World War One, not War Two, but still, Britain was at war with Germany. So often, legal codes and legal cases say, no, a corporation is something different than the people that own it or participate in it. It's its own thing. So a German corporation could be a British citizen. A third view of legal personhood says that corporations are sociological phenomenon. So they are a real thing, right? A real thing in the same way that a tribe is a real thing, right? Um, and the law simply recognizes this pre-existing fact. This is called the reality theory of legal personhood. So reality theory doesn't claim that corporations are intelligent beings, right? They're not persons in the same way that humans are persons, but and it also is not like the fictional view where it says they're created out of thin air, right, by a state or by a legislature. Instead, there are real sociological phenomenon that is its own thing, right? It's not a person, it's not a legal fiction. It's like, a tribe or other sorts of, more abstract phenomena that are nonetheless real in the world. So, I mean, these are all, he's fleshing out all kinds of legal personhood, and you might think that this is how we could understand the personhood of a corporation. But French, in the end, doesn't like the legal personhood approach to answering this question. He says it's not really super helpful if we're asking about, um, you know, if you have a theory of legal personhood, it can help you in determining whether, a corporation should be fined or something like that. But we're asking something slightly different, which is, are they morally responsible, right? Can they be blamed morally? And there's a difference there. So take, for example, um, uh, my insurance company, right? So I might do something to harm someone, right? But if I have liability insurance, my insurance company will be the one that has to pay the person, right? So I would be morally responsible, but my insurance company would be obligated to pay, but they're not morally responsible. So we can make that distinction, right? And so legal personhood, um, you know, is helpful in figuring out who has to pay for something, but it doesn't really tell us a lot about who is morally responsible. Uh, so, for example, legal persons have included things like unborn babies, right? If you legislatures have, made abortion illegal on the basis that they've recognized fetuses as persons. Um, you might call sometimes in some situations dead people might be legal persons and have certain rights. Future generations, so people that don't exist yet. Um, but those typically aren't moral persons, right? A fetus isn't someone, we can't put a fetus in jail, it's not a moral person, right? But even though it can be a legal person, the distinction is they can be subjects of rights, right? So there's these types of legal persons typically are created so that to say you can't do bad things to them, right? Um, but they're not the sorts of things that can uh, act morally and be praised or blamed, right? And that's what we're really concerned about here. The question is, if Shell Oil is, causes in some sense an oil spill, can we blame the corporation morally, right? So these sorts of legal persons that are the subjects of rights is sort of a different question than the question we're asking, right? So, how do we define a moral person? Well, for French, a moral person is any entity that can be ascribed responsibility for some event. So, what does he mean by responsibility? Well, there's a couple senses. One is just, in the sort of the whodunit of a murder. Like you want to say who's responsible for the murder, we're asking, who shot, right, Mr. Mustard in the conservatory or whatever, right? So that's one way you could be responsible for something. The other sense of responsible is more just in a general way accountable, right? Um, or answerable to. So that covers a broader uh, array of cases. You know, if you promise to meet me for coffee but you don't show up, you're in a sense responsible for breaking your promise. That means you owe me an explanation at the very least, or you know something. Say, oh, sorry, I'll take you out again, and I'll pay for the coffee this time, whatever. And you know, there's a sense that you're accountable. You owe somebody something, even if it's just an explanation or an apology. Right? So accountability can arise in a bunch of different ways. Again, you can make a promise, you can sign a contract. Taking a job gives you a certain accountability to your boss. Hiring someone gives you a certain accountability. You know, you have to pay them a paycheck and so on. Um, but moral accountability is a special kind of accountability. Um, for example, it can't just be signed over to someone else like you can a car. So again, for example, if I have liability insurance, I'm sort of signing over a certain amount of my accountability to the insurance company, right? So if, you know, whatever, if I accidentally hurt somebody on my property, but I have liability insurance, um, the insurance company will pay for me. But that doesn't mean that the insurance company is morally responsible or morally accountable, right? That still lies with me. So moral accountability can't be signed away, unlike other kinds of accountability. And you don't really have to sign anything or commit to any contract or anything to become morally responsible. Just you have it, whether you like it or not, right? And you're morally accountable to everybody if you, in some way, you know, harm them, right? Okay, so if the idea is if you're accountable, you're responsible, and if you're responsible, you're a moral person, right? You know, in the special moral sense of each. So what qualifies you as morally accountable and thus as responsible and thus as a moral person and thus as something that can be blamed? You know, again, babies aren't morally responsible to anyone, even if their actions harm somebody. So, and remember, you know, the main question that we're trying to zoom in on here is whether corporations could qualify as accountable, therefore responsible, therefore persons, therefore morally blameworthy. So, what makes you accountable? So, one necessary condition on being accountable or slash responsible for something is that you caused it and you intended to cause it, right? So, you know, I can hurt someone by accident, right? I might fall down and bump into you and cause you to fall down. Um, but I didn't intend to harm you, right? So I'm typically not morally accountable or responsible for that, right? You wouldn't say you're a bad person or something like that if I just made a mistake or an accident. So to be morally responsible, you need not only to cause some negative thing, but also to have intended to cause it, right? And this makes you what French calls a Davidsonian agent. This is named after the philosopher Donald Davidson, who defined this kind of agency. So, if a corporation is going to be morally responsible for something, it has to be a Davidsonian agent, says French. Now, you know, this is all French is what we'll see other philosophers that have different things to say about this, right? But for French, the question of whether a corporation is morally responsible boils down to can corporations intend to do something, right? Can we ascribe an intention to a corporation? Corporations can certainly cause bad things to happen, right? Um, but again, causing a bad thing to happen isn't enough, right? For accountability, you also have to have intended it. And this is the key notion that we need to ask. Can a corporation intend to do something? So, what is an intention, right? Notice we keep defining terms, but uh, we are getting somewhere, I promise, right? So the first thing to know about intention with a T is that is intentional with an S. So a statement is intentional with an S if its truth value changes under different, what we call co-referential descriptions. I'll explain what that means. So I don't know if you know the story of Hamlet, right? But Hamlet is looking to kill someone, um, and he thinks they're hiding in Gertrude's room, and so he rushes in and stabs the guy behind the curtain, right? Turns out Hamlet made a mistake. The guy he stabbed was his friend Polonius. Um, so we could say Hamlet intended to stab the person behind the curtain, for sure, but we wouldn't say Hamlet intended to kill Polonius, even though Polonius is the same person as the one behind the curtain, right? So even though um, the action is the same in either case, under different descriptions, the sentence comes out true or false, right? So this is a special thing that intentions and beliefs and other sort of mental states have, is that under one description they're true, under another description they're false, even though it's the exact same situation we're describing, right? Um, so can corporations have intentions in the with a T, right? Meaning they would have to be intentional with an S. So to do something intentionally is to do it for a reason, right? You desire some outcome, and that's why you did the thing, right? And for sure, the individual members of a corporation have desires, and they certainly do things for reasons. But the question is, could a corporation have a desire, and could a corporation do something for a reason, right? Or are corporate desires and reasons always reducible to human desires and reasons, right? Is it the case that there's really no sense in saying a corporation wanted to do something? It's only a metaphor for saying the people that compose the corporation wanted to do something, right? So French is going to argue now that yes, corporations can have intentions, corporations can do things for reasons, and this is the result of what he calls their corporate internal decision structure, or CID structure. And we're going to describe what that is in just a moment. So a CID structure has two elements that are relevant to moral responsibility. Um, there should be somewhere, either explicitly or implicitly, a sort of a responsibility flowchart that shows how decision-making power and responsibility are organized in the corporation, right? So for example, if all decisions have to ultimately flow through the CEO, right, who gives orders to the people lower down, or if sometimes something has to be referred to a lawyer, and then if the lawyer gives the okay, then the CEO will say it's okay, and so on. So there's all sorts of different responsibilities, and you can imagine these little boxes in the flow chart that says, well, uh, first the idea comes from this person, and it has to go to the lawyer first, then it goes to the CEO, and then it goes to CFO, and any one of those could veto it, right? But if they all approve it, then orders go down to the accountant to write checks or whatever, right? So there's a flow chart of all the responsibilities of the various offices, right? And number two, um, they need corporate decision recognition rules that govern procedures for making group decisions in line with the organizational flowchart, right? So there's a flowchart that shows the structure, and then there's a set of rules that says how decisions flow through that structure, right? And um, how corporate actions result. So when these processes work together, we do get, claims French, corporate decisions, and they are the result of a synthesis of individual intentions and desires. Um, but the individual desires of each person are not identical to the decisions of the corporation, right? So again, as the accountant, I might think that some decision is a bad idea, right? But if I'm ordered to do it by the CEO, as the accountant, I have to write the check, even if I don't want to or desire to write the check, right? So certainly different people's desires are inputs to this overall structure, but in the end, the corporation has an intention that might differ from any one member of the corporation's own intentions or desires, right? So each biological person in the corporation is represented in the flow chart, right? Their job. And that governs to what degree their personal intentions can affect the corporate decision. But the corporate decision, yeah, is different than any individual person's decision. Um, and as I just said, each person in the flowchart is not necessarily acting on their own desires or intentions, right? Rather, they're acting on based on their position in the flowchart. So, the staff accountant, again, maybe all he wants to do is go home and play guitar, and he really doesn't want to write this huge check that he knows is going to bankrupt the corporation, but he does it anyways, right? Um, and it's the recognition rules, the part two, that identifies what constraints there are on each individual person, right, as the next step in the flowchart comes to them, right, and they play their role in this decision. Once all this has happened, right? The recognition rule says a corporate decision has been made, right? It has gone through the proper channels, right? Everyone has had their input relative to their the constraints of their office, and we have made a decision, and the corporation is going to act in a certain way. Right? So to take an example, Gulf Oil. I'm not sure if Gulf still exists, right? They were more like a Texas thing, I think. I don't see Gulf Oil too much around here. But suppose there's three executives at Gulf Oil, X, Y, and Z, and they need to make a decision as to whether Gulf should join this world uranium cartel, right? They want to get into the uranium business, and a bunch of different companies are getting together to form this cartel that's going to control the uranium supply in the world, right? Maybe it's it's going to make profits, but maybe it's a little unethical or sketchy. Okay, so X, Y, and Z. Um, they're going to get lots of inputs from lots of different executives that are going to tell them, okay, here's what the profitability is, here's our legal exposure, and so on, right? So they're going to get a lot of information that they have to synthesize. Um, how much will it cost? How do we get into the uranium production business, right? We have to build plants and so on. And some of those plans, right, might even recommend an action, right? So, the I keep picking on the accountant, but the accountant, in their office might send a report saying, this will be really profitable and I recommend it, or this will not be profitable, I don't recommend it, right? Um, and so on. There might be, the lawyers will have an input and they say, I think that this will be perfectly legal and I recommend you do it, or I don't, and so on. And these have all been filtering through the CID system, um, and many of the biological people's personal desires and beliefs may have been altered to fit their organizational role. Again, one of the lawyers might think, I think this is a bad idea, I think this is immoral, but the question for the lawyer is it legal, right? So in their role as the corporate lawyer, they just have to report, yes, it is legal, even if they don't particularly want to do this thing. And suppose that the corporation's decision recognition rules state that the outcome of a vote held among these three executives constitutes a decision by the corporation. So they get all their inputs, but then it boils down to they take a vote and majority rules, right? Um, so say X and Y vote yes and Z votes no, or something like that. So no individual vote constitutes a decision by the corporation. It's not that any one of these executives uh, own personal human right desires and intentions is the same as the corporate intentions. The decision in the end might not reflect anybody's actual intentions or desires, right? It might all be, the question might be, is this profitable? And the decision structure might be set up such that if it's legal and it's profitable, then they have to do it, even though maybe every person in the corporation thinks, I think this is actually a really terrible, immoral thing to do. But, given my job, I just have to give my input. Um, so again, yeah, the decision of the corporation could be actually in conflict with what everybody desires in the corporation, maybe, right? So, maybe company lawyer A wrote an opinion saying, well, joining the cartel would be legal, but personally he might think, gosh, I hope we don't do this. This seems like a bad thing, even though it's legal. And, executive X may vote against it, Y and Z might vote for it. But again, Y and Z might personally think, I wouldn't, I personally don't like this, but yeah, it's best for the company, but it'll increase profits or whatever. So whatever the combination of all those factors, in the end, if they made a vote and the majority rules to join the cartel, the corporation made a decision to join the cartel, according to French, right? The corporation itself had an intention and made a decision. So, did the corporation have reasons for its decision, right? Was it intentional? French says yes. And again, they're independent of any biological person's reasons. Um, the reasons might be in the, articles of incorporation of the, when they form the company, there's a explanation of how the company should make decisions. And that document outlines the sort of cognitive structure of the corporation, which is, again, independent of any of the people. So back to intentionality with an S, right? So we said that intentional states are intentional with an S, which is to say they may be true under one description, false under another. So suppose, for example, that joining the cartel ends up being a bad idea and the company fails and goes bankrupt, right? It would be true to say the company intended to join the cartel, but it would be false to say that the company intended to commit suicide and go bankrupt, right? So we do have that intentionality with an S, right? Which French says that's evidence that this is, in fact, a genuine intention, a reason that the corporation used to act, and therefore counts as morally blameworthy or a praiseworthy action, right? Likewise, executive X might have voted to join the cartel because he was bribed, but it wouldn't make sense to say Gulf Oil joined the cartel because it was bribed, right? The individual had his own reasons and his own interests that are distinct from the company, right? Gulf Oil didn't get the money. So while executive X might be morally culpable for taking a bribe, it's not at all clear that Gulf Oil would be morally culpable for that. Again, all that money went to the executive. Gulf Oil, uh, the corporate decision structure wasn't set up to do illegal things or to take bribes. It was just one of the members of the corporation took the bribe. And if joining the cartel turns out to be morally evil, that culpability falls on Gulf Oil, not necessarily on, the accountant or the lawyer at Gulf Oil, right? The lawyer might have been saying, no, I think this is immoral, but my job is to say whether it's legal, and yeah, it's legal, right? So you wouldn't blame the lawyer even if the corporation does an evil thing. Or, Executive Y. If Executive Y voted against joining it, they had the most power in the situation, but they joined it anyways because Y lost the vote. You wouldn't blame Y, even though the corporation did make this decision. So this is French's account, right? I think it's good to start with this one to make sense of the notion that, yeah, a corporation could be morally culpable, right? Um, and then we're going to follow up with some. There's been a lot of years of sort of back and forth with this argument, and other philosophers who argue that no, corporations are not morally culpable on their own. Okay, so I will see you next time, and thank you very much.